Welcome to another episode of Uncle Nene's Nerdcast. I'm your host, Nathan Fletcher, aka Uncle Nene. We got a great show for you today. We are going old school Star Wars, episode 4, 5, and 6. We're going to dig into everything about the show. We've got a great guest. He's a filmmaker and kind of a self-made expert on episode 4, 5, and 6. And he spent years in the same field as I am in production, and but he has done some incredible documentaries. So it's great to have him on the show. Welcome, Gregory Beck.
All right, thanks for having me.
So, are you good with me calling you Greg for the show?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Excellent.
absolutely.
Thanks for being on. I like to start the show with a question, which is I always found it fascinating. What is your earliest memory of Star Wars?
I remember somebody telling me, and I was 5.
Okay. All
so
right.
we are talking earliest memories, but they
Yeah.
are vivid. They are vivid. They're true. I verified. Somebody was telling me, like another kid was telling me, and he had pictures on the wall, and it was pictures of stormtroopers and Chewbacca. And there's
Okay.
this iconic picture of Chewbacca standing in a Death Star hallway somewhere, holding his bowcaster. And I remember looking at those pictures thinking, oh, I'm terrified of Bigfoot, but you're telling me this is the good guy. And all these guys in white are the bad guys.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, that's right. And I could not wrap my head around this, but I was immediately in. The crisp look of the stormtroopers and all that sort of thing. It's just something about that was very appealing. And I grew up in a small town called Windsor, Colorado. And Windsor was a farm town in northern Colorado, kind of out on the Pawnee grasslands. And Windsor had about 3,500 people, and we had a one screen theater, and it had 4 seats in the row with 2 aisles down the side, and it probably sat 35, 40 people tops.
Wow.
I mean, this is an old
Wow.
school. Yeah, that it doesn't exist anymore. It's just a hole in the street there where there's a park bench or something. But I remember trying to convince my friend's mom to take us to see this movie. She goes, "You sure that's not going to be too scary?" I was like, "No, I have to see this." And I remember professing how important it was that I had to see this movie. And I remember sitting in the theater, standing in line, and you bought your tickets at the window, right? So we stood in line, you waited for 2.5 hours or whatever it is for the next showing, and you got in. I couldn't tell you if this was the original release. I think this was the extended period, because they released the movie, it went gangbusters, and it had limited theaters. Well, then, everybody wanted the movie, and so all the small theaters got it too. So maybe it was later in the summer or something like that.
Right.
I would have to go back and look at the data as when they released it, but I know I saw it in a theater and being completely confused when the opening scene is there's this dude, a rebel, holding and taking focus and aim on the door that Vader and his troopers were coming through. And I think, well, that's an old guy. Is this about an old guy? And being very confused about that. And then you don't really meet the heroes till well into it. You meet your villain right off the bat, and of course, madly in love with Vader because children love power, and this guy is the ultimate power.
Yes.
And thought, wow, that's a bad dude, and he kills the guy in the first scenes, and that just, I have to tell you, Pulp Fiction made me want to be a filmmaker. Star Wars made me want to be a person.
Right.
So one was formative and one was the other, because people are, Star Wars made you want to be a filmmaker. No.
Yeah.
Star Wars was formative for everything. So
that's
from
great.
that moment on, I was in.
That's great. What a great story. For me, my memories of early Star Wars were VHS related. I don't have those early memories of the theater.
Yep.
But I remember the VHS movies. And, it's funny because when I was young, I remember Return of the Jedi was the movie. Luke has all the power, and so it was so much. You said children love power, so it was so much cooler. Yes. But then as I got older, Empire became my favorite.
Of course. Yeah.
And then of course I loved the re-release in the theaters later on after he did more special effects and stuff. I really enjoyed that. Then I got to experience the theater. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to focus kind of on.
Can I say something about that VHS thing?
Yeah.
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because that was how we really started to absorb Star Wars, was VHS. And I through dubious means or whatnot, my father got a copy that was recorded in a theater.
Okay,
And I
gotcha.
was the most popular kid on the block because I had a VHS pirated copy where we could watch Star Wars anytime, because it was few and far between of your viewings and your bragging rights. How many times have you seen Star Wars? Oh,
Right.
I'm
Oh
up in the
yeah.
50s now, guys. And kids would walk around, you'd be like, can we come over to your house and watch the pirated? And it was terrible, right? There
Yeah.
was flubs in the tape and everything. So it's really interesting that you bring up the VHS thing, because I would say for the next 15 to 20 years, your life was kind of centered around what's the next copy I can get. And
Oh
I
yeah.
remember recording it when they finally played it on ABC, and I would try to record out the commercial so I had a clean cut.
Yeah.
But it was all on VHS. And then, of course, then they released it on VHS, which, why did that take so long? And it was just
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And then DVD or what was the laser disc? Remember those? Or
Oh,
the records that you could play in?
yes.
Those were all a big
Yep.
deal. And
Yeah.
I have owned every media copy of Star Wars from that pirated VHS tape, which was worn out to nothing. I wish I still had it. I don't think it exists anymore. Anyway, I thought that was very interesting that you brought up the VHS, because that really is, people don't understand, younger people don't understand, who have come up with the streaming services or just downloads or even DVDs and Blu-rays. You don't understand how precious that VHS tape became, and
Yeah.
getting your hands on a copy or a rental and being able to go home and watch Star Wars.
Yeah. Having being able to watch things when you want them,
Yeah,
when you want to watch them, is a new experience, relatively speaking.
absolutely.
And you're right. If you grew up in that world where everything was just so easy to watch, it's different than, we grew up in that, like, oh man, if only we could watch it.
I would love to see
It's
that,
a
because you would
different
have
thing.
arguments. Who said what? And is that really what
Yes.
he said? And,
Oh
the
yeah.
dialogue, and the kids that knew all the dialogue, like myself, kids would stand around you and watch you recite Star Wars because you had it on VHS.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was
Absolutely.
totally magical. It was such a big deal. We are the Gen X. There's that plight of the Gen Xer that's grown up with all these different medias, and they have to constantly adjust what media they're used to. So we
Yes.
went from records to tape cassettes and eight
Yep.
track to CDs to downloads to streaming. And there's a lot of funny memes out there, but yeah, our
Yes.
generation definitely capitalized on whatever media was available to us at the time.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I thought we'd start kind of with his, kind of these classic influences that
Mhm.
started the Saturday matinee serials, Kurosawa's films,
Yep.
Joseph Campbell's hero myths, kind of
Yes.
shaped Lucas's vision for Star Wars. Can you kind of talk about that, and like what did he borrow, and those kind of things?
Sure. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up Lucas's upbringing. And he grew up with a father that owned his own business, and he was a little bit rebellious at the time. So you start to see how he starts to mix in his world experiences. He was in a really bad car wreck as a teenager, should have killed him from all accounts. And, you'll hear there's a million videos out there of him talking about, how that influenced, but he was a big gearhead, a la American Graffiti. So those are the sort of influences I think that kind of formed him.
Mm,
And then he went to USC to learn, I think he was going to study anthropology,
mm.
and his dad was a little bit against this. He would go get a business degree. You're going to come back and run the paper company, or whatever the company was that his dad owned, office supplies. And so he goes and starts taking anthropology classes, and he starts to learn about these cultures and myth and mythology and that sort of thing. And he really gets drawn into that. And at the same time, he is starting to play with visual media, and he's filming things in, still cameras or stop motion or, 8 millimeter, sort of playing around with those. And of course, he gets in with all these other kids that are doing the same thing, people that now still work for him, and they're these legends in the industry. So his influences really he starts to sponge in influence from around him, and it affects him. I don't think he ever really wanted to become a filmmaker initially. It was that he wanted to express these sort of ideas.
Interesting.
Um, the the most fascinating thing I think about George Lucas is his patience with media and the way to make film. He learned the most traditional ways, and it very impressive that he adapted and learned all these new things and then made them work for him. Um, you brought up Kurosawa. So, he started to fall in love with these very simple stories with
Yeah,
complex emotive
yeah.
qualities.
And
Um,
following the two lowly characters, like the way he follows the droids, like the Hidden
yes,
Fortress with Kurosawa, like I think that was something particularly new, and you could see it reflected in all his works, you know.
absolutely. The perspective of those two droids, or the two peasants,
Right.
is really unique, because
Yeah.
everybody, if you ask somebody that's not, I don't know, I don't want to sound snobby or anything like that, but somebody's not studied in those ideas, they're like, who's the movie's perspective from? Luke? No, it's from R2D2 and C3PO. I mean, everything is from their perspective, and they're witnessing this world transformation right in front of them, and they were kind of formed by that. We didn't learn that till later, but they were really
Yeah.
formed by that sort of thing, which I think is really interesting. Um, some of the other influences, I think, you brought up Joseph Campbell, which, apparently he was sitting down with Campbell and reading his books, and actually, I mean, he was his mentor for a long time. Excuse me.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they were good friends, and so he was going back as he was rewriting Star Wars, and we're talking 73 through 75 ish. He's going back to Campbell and talking about this hero's journey and all these trials and tribulations, and how mythology was really a very boiled down sense of how we come to the planet, how we learn the planet, and how we die. So that, and he starts to mix in your influences, like your father, very interesting. And then how the son often has to slay the father, and these sort of things, and you find out these are very ancient tropes. And so
Right.
George just basically said, I can do that for a kids movie. It'll be
Right.
easy to make, right? Well,
And
it was
was
anything but.
Vader? I've of course read that Vader was based on his father because he had such a rough relationship with his father. Is have you've heard that too?
You bet. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think they eventually, they never severed their father son relationship, but there was definitely a rebellious feel to that. And his dad was not pleased with the filmmaking thing at all. Um, to be honest with you, I don't know if his father got to see the Star Wars saga.
Right.
I think he got to realize, a little bit with THX 1138, and seeing that he'd done really well with his student film, and then how that got translated into a feature, and then maybe American Graffiti. I'm a little fuzzy on the history of where his father passed away in that
Mm.
timeline, but that's really, really interesting. And as you start to look at your relationship with your father, or you watch your son, or you see these things happening, it's pretty poignant, and it's deeper than you might think.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
all the sparkle and glitter were just that. They were just
Yeah.
sparkle and glitter, and it was means of telling that trope.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a friend ask me like, "Well, what is Star Wars really about?" Uh, and I said, "Well, the original Lucas trilogy, I feel like, is really about family. It's
One hundred
that's
percent.
really what it's about. There's, yes, it's a western kind of, it's a opera, the kind of, but for me, it's really about family. I think
Yes.
those family dynamics are really what the heart of it, anyways, is about.
And that's what's hard for us as storytellers, is to find that real baseline story, and then you can wrap it in any genre you want.
Yeah.
And Lucas was very good at that, especially in that early saga. He really, really tightened it down and got it boiled down to the very basics, and then put a little candy wrapper on it that blew everybody's mind, which is
Yeah.
super interesting. The family aspect is, and that carries through into the prequels.
Yeah.
Where does this all come from? How does it come about? How is Anakin really pushed over the edge? Well, I mean, family was destroyed, and it
Right.
wrecked him, right?
Right. Right.
And those are ancient tropes as well. So that origin story is super fascinating, and those are stories that have been super fascinating for mankind since the dawn of cave dwellings.
Yeah.
Those are the very basic tropes.
So I wanted to talk about, one of the kind of, or some of the script changes that happened early on in episode 4, A New Hope.
Mhm.
There was, of course, the Star Killer was the name of the base, and then also Obi-Wan was not originally planned to die, and then they
Right.
changed that. and I would love to know kind of you've learned about that, or what your thoughts are on those early script changes or character differences.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that if you hear him talk about Campbell, those story changes came along as he interviewed with Campbell. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, Mace Windu in the Journal of the Wills, I think I'm saying that correctly, was like one of the first things, and it was the Star Wars. And there's these little things that you see in there that you think, oh, that's just kind of fumbling around with ideas. No, they were pretty concrete. And killing off characters here and there was really interesting. Vader at one point was kind of this misleading hero. Um, the names were different. Chewbacca was a very different stylized character visually. Han Solo, I think, was always there. I think the princess wasn't really brought into it until he started thinking about what's the outcome of Luke, and if Luke doesn't survive, what happens? How does he do these things? And the original Star Killer was a bad dude. He was a very morally ambiguous style character. He's probably more like Boba Fett, I think.
Fascinating.
And that's my speculation. But there was he was to be more conflicted and much darker, and he eventually was going to destroy the universe. And then Lucas went back and said, no, you have to have that hero post that
Right.
everything can pivot around for this perspective of these droids. And they had to be, they had to tag along. So the mechanics of the story changed it as much as and his influences changed it as much as any kind of rewrites or this just doesn't work and that sort of thing. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine a Luke Star Killer? It just sounds so
Right.
awful.
Sounds very
You
strange.
know, it sounds so awful.
Yeah, it doesn't any intentionally change Skywalker to make it a more hopeful, optimistic,
Right.
stylized character. And
Yeah.
Luke is a bright-eyed, stupid kid
Yeah.
that's experiencing the world. He's all of us, right? It's everybody
Right.
at 17 or 14 when you decide that home is not for me, out there is for me,
Right.
and I'm stuck here. I need to get out there, which is
Yeah.
really closely identified with Lucas and his youth when he was trying to come into his own.
Right. His character sounds so much more like a Skywalker than a Star Killer, and so I think it's
Yeah,
fascinating how that was
I
entertained at
think
some
they
point.
brought the Star Killer name back, and I'm not real
Really?
informed on the extended universe.
Yeah.
But I think there's a video game series out there where there's a Star Killer. I could be
Okay.
wrong. I'm sure there are some
It's
Star Wars
interesting.
nuts out there that are pounding their
Well,
desk right now listening to me do this. But
we'll
um,
find out for sure.
yeah, yeah.
Do you know why they decided to kill off Obi-Wan?
I know Guinness wasn't happy about it because it wasn't until later in filming that they decided, or Lucas decided,
Oh,
I
they
gotta
had
have.
already started filming when they
Oh
decided
yeah.
that. Oh,
So it was a change midstream. Um, I think what it really comes down to is there had to be a supreme motivator for Luke to do what he does and go on. Just going back and blowing up the Death Star and high five and Obi-Wan wasn't enough. And he also needed Obi-Wan with him. Um, he couldn't do that alone. He,
right,
he couldn't do
right,
that without that boost. And that voice was, it was not a dream. It was not a psychotic episode. He wasn't
right,
being narcissistic or anything like that. He was genuinely hearing Obi-Wan with him, and
right,
and and without that, he probably would have missed because the other guy took the shot, used all the
right.
computers and technology, and it really comes down to what's in his spirit. And I think there's a documentary that was made for TV show that was um, narrated by Mark Hamill. It was a BTS, it was one of the first BTS videos or films to ever come out. And Hamill, finishes, summarizes it by saying, Star Wars is really not about all that technology. In fact, and I'm paraphrasing, but he rejects the technology and decides it's human spirit is what's going to get him through this.
Okay,
And that might be one of the um, cornerstone or mantles of that story is, forget the technology. It's what's
right.
inside. It's not what's surrounding you. It's what's inside of you that really gets you through that. And I think that's poignant too. I think that spoke to a lot of us younger people at the time.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of those kind of conversations happening at the time as technology started to take place in the 70s. You really had, this very early on, discussion of computers and things like that. And then, that's why you had, I think, 2001 and, you had space travel and all of that kind of shaping people's minds. Where does this go? Do we
Right.
lose our humanity as we, so I think that was also something great that he worked in there.
And tied in with that is the kind of the geopolitical world at the time.
Yeah,
Lucas was kind of a revolutionary. He did not like big centralized power and that sort of a thing. I wouldn't go so far as to say he was a communist, but he was certainly thinking in those circles.
yeah,
And the small rebel force overtakes and defeats the empire. Well, we see that across history all the time.
right.
The American
And he just came
Revolution.
out of the Vietnam era, so they knew
That's
exactly what that looks like.
he was going to direct Apocalypse Now. He and
Yeah,
Coppola had batted that thing around for years, and he was one of the primary story developers for Apocalypse Now, and which very much based around these small rebels and taking over and really wrecking the plans of the big corporate empire. I certainly don't necessarily endorse those ideas. Um, not, I'm not getting political on that. I'm thinking in terms of um, what is right or what's wrong. It's just it's a fact that if you push somebody too far, no matter how small or meek they might feel or be, their will to win often will subvert the bigger mechanized efforts in these world powers, and I think that's really interesting.
absolutely. I've always said that uh, Star Wars versus Star Trek, one of the things where they're different, that in the Star Trek universe, humanity is crushing it, right?
Right,
Humanity is just this utopian society. There's no
figured
money.
it out.
Everything is just perfect
Yep,
for humanity. Whereas Star Wars, which would be how we want it, right? Star Trek is how we want it. Star Wars is more like how it is, right? There is,
much more messy.
people. There is an empire, and there will always part of human nature is the lust for power, and so there has to be people willing to rebel against the establishment if there's an evil empire, and
Yep.
I love that. It's like Andor is a great series because it really talks about revolution and rebellion,
Yes. Yes.
which is a universal theme of Star Wars. So even though there's not Jedi's, right? There's not that part of it. There is the heart of Star Wars, which has that
Yeah.
kind of rebellion, revolution element and theme to it.
And I think that's probably what most of us enjoyed about um, Andor was what you just said is kind of you get to see what oppression really is
Yeah,
and how political it is and how interweaved into the bureaucracies it becomes and you have some very different worldviews. At the last episode, hopefully not spoiling for anybody, but two of the pivotal characters discuss and really vent their worldview. One is like, you want this oppressive lack of freedom, and he's like, well, you want anarchy. I mean, what is it you're trying to do here? And that was super interesting play. And all of that is very relevant to both those sides.
yeah,
Um, and I think maybe they could have been a little more or shown a little more empathy, but then you lose your villain side of that thing. But it would have been cool to see a little more empathy for what we call the dark side or the imperial mindset.
yeah.
The rebel was pretty obvious. I think what Andor did was made it a little more morally ambiguous. The,
Right,
the things these rebels have to do, and
right.
that's something that gets repeated over and
Yeah,
over again in Andor and in Rogue One is we've all done bad things here, and it's
yeah.
all I am condemned to use the methods of my enemy to kill them,
Right,
and
right.
those are
Yep.
very important points to that whole story.
Yeah,
And that's something we didn't really get in Star Wars too
yeah.
much. You get little
No,
flutterings of that, but
no.
this ties in. Why are these people winning? Would they have won without Luke?
Right,
Maybe.
right.
Who knows?
Yeah,
But um, and none of those rebels know Luke. You know,
Right.
he's a hero
Right.
at the very end of episode 4, but really, he's just kind of this guy that swoops in and does some good stuff. But the rebellion happens because people finally came together with forgot their infighting and remembered their singleness of purpose and went out and won. And that's very compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Eh, you know, trying, I don't really get political on the show, but
Yep.
I will say that the parallels for me, anyways, when I watched Andor and also when I think of the original Star Wars, because I am who I am, I think of the American Revolution and the British
Me
Empire.
too.
And that's I
I
kind of
very much feel
parallel.
the same way.
I
Right.
view it like that, you know. Um, but you know, where whatever Lucas's inspiration is one that's the kind of the parallel that jumps out in my mind because
Sure.
you know the reality is that Americans had to be kind of brutal in their revolution if they wanted freedom, and so you know there
Yep.
were those that had to sacrifice their morality
Yep.
to get to you know to get what they needed to get
They
the freedom. And
absolutely they veered from the um, politically correct way to conduct war. And
right.
guerrilla warfare was almost perfected by those revolutionaries in the American colonies. And you know, they literally were harvesting hay one day and fighting the redcoats the next.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, Andor touches on that. You see these
Yeah.
people trying to survive and then taking a second, go blow something up, and then come back and
Yeah.
try it again,
Back to work in the
and
fields.
then
Yeah.
back to work. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's very compelling, and we see it time and time again. I mean, it goes ancient times. We've seen that
All
happen.
revolutions have those stories. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. So, the next thing I wanted to talk about, you know, of course, what everybody I think thinks about when they think of Star Wars is the movie magic and the production design and the effects. It's
The
a
good stuff.
fascinating thing. It was such back then. It was revolutionary,
Right.
and you know there was um, you know, I was reading somewhere about when the studio executive Alid Ladd Jr. pitched Star
That's right.
Wars to the Fox board.
Yep.
He brought David McQuarrie's artwork to the Vision, and you know those early designs of Darth Vader's armor, R2D2, C3PO look also
So
unique.
good. Yep.
You know, what are your kind of your thoughts on that, and you know, any kind of you know inspirations that you've heard about, and you know, I've read stuff, but I'm curious what you think.
Sure. Going back to our youth, you know, a lot of those designs were out in early media publications. So we got to see those fairly early on. I don't know if it was right during Star Wars, but as Star Wars built,
Yeah.
anybody and everything was looking for Star Wars content. So you would see
Yep.
those McQuarrie matte paintings and his inspiration designs or, you know, that sort of thing. And then Joe Johnston starts to sketch out ships and the X-Wing and the TIE fighter. And so all these things start to come up and you see them in their most raw form. Um, and the way I've gathered is Lucas would, you know, kind of heavy handedly watch these guys work and be like, no, this is going to change this because the thrusters for this work this way. And he would, and in his mind, he was giving it. And so these guys would go back and reshape things. You know, everything was taken from his script. So, you know, McQuarrie's kind of sitting there thinking, okay, what does a stormtrooper look like? And in the, you know,
Right.
in the script, it's very concise. So he had to come up with, you know, these are troops that can go from one ship to the next, and they have to have battle armor, and they have to have breathing apparatus. Vader's original concept wasn't that he was in a dark hooded mess of a man inside. It was that he could wear a mask, that he could jump from ship to ship, you know, and have to not be exposed to space. That's why Vader originally had a mask.
Really, I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, so you know,
That's
and of
fascinating.
course Lucas is very influenced by the samurai, so
Right.
he would get with McQuarrie and say, well, let's make sure this suit does have some dark connotations to it. And the samurai was a very feared sort of figure, and I love this design. And so you look at, you know, there's a million publications again out there that
Yes.
show Vader right next to a samurai warrior battle
Yes.
armor, and they're very very similar. So you
Yeah,
know
that
there was
was
that
that
inspiration
always
is
jumped out at
iconic.
me, the samurai. I could see that. I didn't know about the space jumping. I think that's incredible. It's really interesting. You
Laser
know, that
swords were kind of the same thought. That was,
yes.
you know, those were more inspired by how would these guys deal with some of the things that they're dealing with And is it a unique enough thing? And oh yeah, it's a princess prince, villain story. There's got to be swords in there somehow. How does that relevant? So, as they were designing, Lucas was coming up with his greater story down the road is like, well, that's the weapon of a Jedi, of course. It's a more elegant, sort of
Yeah.
an apparatus, and those were seriously fascinating things. So I think as he went through and was developing the movie, his inspiration, he started to become self-informed, and as he's world building, these sort of things that we take for granted and just think Star Wars were somewhat developed out of um, necessity. The Millennium Falcon's a really good example of that. They had originally designed it and it looked like a long something you would have seen. I'll get to that point in just a second, but it was very different. Okay, it looked more like
Right.
a rocket
Yeah.
ship. It looked like
Yes.
something that would have taken off vertically and gone straight up and then landed on its landing platform. Well, a TV show comes out, a British sci-fi program called Space 1999 comes out, and they have a ship that looks too much like the Millennium Falcon. And
Yeah.
mind you, they have already built in the studios in England, um, full scale mock ups of the Millennium Falcon. He's like, got to redo it. And he
Yeah.
took a bite of a cheeseburger. And they're like, what do you want us to do? He took a bite of a cheeseburger, set his Coke can or something next to him, and was like, I want it to look like that. And
Wow.
so
I didn't know
they
that story.
literally,
The
yeah, they
cheeseburger
went
thing.
from
Wow.
this long cylindrical thing to something that looked like this with a weird cockpit on the side. And
Yeah.
the cockpit was what the cockpit was from the original ship, and they just kind of stuck it on the side of a hamburger box and
Yeah.
kind of went from there. So um, that's super interesting. So again, he's kind of influencing and pivoting, probably much to his detriment, into the absolute panic of the executives who are shelling
Yeah.
out. I think they started with $3 million for him to make it. Then they got it to five. I think it ended up being about $7.5 to $8 million to finish the movie.
Wow.
But those sort of things really,
Yeah.
as
Man.
producers, we understand the pain of that.
Yes. Man. That was, yeah, I had heard the story about how the ship, they had to change it because something came out that looked very similar. I like how it's like one of the few ships in the Star Wars universe that kind of looks like a flying saucer. There's sort of
Yeah,
that influence of,
I'm
all the
sure that
flying
was
saucer.
some inspiration there. Let's make it look like a flying saucer, but not
Yeah.
whirling kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is very fascinating. What have you heard about the kind of the space battles that kind of have a World War II dogfight feel? What have you heard about the X-wing versus the TIE fighter battles? Of course,
sure.
as a kid you love them because they're something that seems familiar,
Because they
and
were real. They were the real deal. They were
yeah,
that was footage that Lucas, because he had to do the animatics, because ILM was a mess and they were very
okay,
slow. And he was getting to the point where he had to start showing cuts, not just dailies, but cuts of the film to executives and some of the other, post production filmmakers. So he would cut in World War II footage of dogfights and
oh,
this, and it cuts
fascinating,
over this. And so you would see these, and I've seen either somebody's summation or maybe it was an original but he was creating animatics is what we call them today. But if you look at some of the things that he was showing these guys, these World War II cuts, and then Luke in the chair shooting at these TIE fighters going by, and then they cut back to these World War II shots. Well, that's told ILM and the executives, this is what you can expect.
wow, I didn't know
ILM was
that. That's
really
amazing.
slow. Yeah, Dykstra was running it, and it was a little bit of a free for all, and they weren't quite sure what Lucas was looking for. And I think he was, if hopefully I'm not misrepresenting this, he was looking for a faster cut. He was looking for
uh,
things to go much more quickly. So 1.5 seconds could tell you a lot. Um, but I need several of these and these trench run things and
yeah,
those sort of dynamics. He couldn't convey with paper airplanes. He's like, no, the
right,
angles and the cameras need to be this. And so that's what felt familiar for a lot of us was the speed of the cut and
yeah,
these really grand movements. Well, you know, I'm wandering from your point. I hope not too badly.
go for it.
But that dictated a lot of the technology, and this is where they say he changed filmmaking. He absolutely did, and
Yeah,
it was at his insistence. This can't be 2001 where we had these long 3 minute
right,
things where, we're trying to mash rotation with the space station. No, these
Right.
things go dive bombing in and blasts are going off. We're intercutting that with the characters reacting and feeling these things. That changed everything because motion control really became a heavy lift for these guys, and they literally built this motion control machine, the Dijkstraflex, I think, that
Hmm.
could repeat the movements. And we're talking 1970s technology. So
Yeah.
not a lot of processors, right? These are big
Right.
computers that would have to
Yeah.
repeat the movements, and then they would shoot it 3 times. Once on blue, once on black, once on white, and so we
Yeah.
can get all the matte work later on, on how they printed that, but it was extremely arduous. And you think
And it was the Dijkstraflex. That was the name. Yeah.
very
Amazing.
very complicated, and it was invented for that movie. And of course then they had to figure out how to do the next one, and you go back and
Right.
look at the effects in Star Wars, there's really not that many. So
Right.
that's pretty impactful on your storytelling when you can have it, so what we consider to be so few effects now. And then Jedi is, how many TIE fighters are flying through that final battle in Jedi. They
Right.
really perfect it, and it looks amazing. Even
Well,
if you don't look
they,
at the re-releases, the
yeah.
motion control compositing that they did was incredible.
Well, I think the one, talk about inventive filmmaking, using the mirrors to obscure the wheels on
That's right.
the. I mean that was what to talk about a great practical effect that is
Yep.
just uses light and some common sense, but I don't
Yep.
think too many people would even think of doing that. And so, I think using those type of DIY solutions and practical effects were incredible. Were there any other of those that you can kind of think of like that, like the mirrors that kind of jump out at you?
I'm trying to think of anything that was specific like that. I would like to touch on the idea that that's what we as filmmakers love.
Right.
Ron Howard said it best. Filmmakers are really creative problem solvers. And
Yeah.
going back to the speeder crossing the Tatooine landscape, um, it, there was no good way to do that, and that all they had
Right.
was 3 tires on this makeshift buggy. And he's like, that thing's supposed to be floating, so we either got to raise the camera up so we don't see the tires, we got to bring it down. Well, the shots that he's starting to invent, there was no way of doing that. So him and a bunch of grips sit around and say, what if we just stuck some mirrors on there? Well, it was okay, but a lot of people don't know they took Vaseline on the print and smudged it out on the print of the film to try to just
Ah,
obscure those mirrors a little bit better. And when
right.
you watch the original cut, it looks rough. As a kid or
Yeah.
as any moviegoer in 1977, we didn't care. Look at that thing
Looked like
floating across.
magic.
That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
So those are the sort of, the creative problem solving that came with that. Going back to the motion control, or I'll actually go a little further into that because John Knoll didn't come into the Star Wars universe or the company until well after the original trilogy was made. And he would constantly get into trouble or cross ways with Lucas because he wanted to build practical miniatures. And Lucas is
Yeah.
like, we got to do this in computers because Lucas has an agenda, which wasn't wrong, but he wants to go all digital. Well, John Knowles like, I'm going to do what I have to get the shot. So he would come up with these miniatures. But what was his inspiration? Tippett, who did all the motion stop of the Tauntauns and won an Academy Award for it. They were creative problem solving. He's like, I'm going to take this old idea, Jason and the Argonauts, and I'm going to make stop motion Tauntauns, and then you'll be able to cut in immediately and get a live shot of Luke on the back of this thing. How are we going to do that? Well, we've got to make it look like they're moving. So they were able to really bring in motion blur and really perfect that process so that the Tauntauns, didn't look
Yeah.
too stoppy. They actually had
Yeah.
movement
They
to them,
had,
which
yeah.
was super interesting. And that is, there's an entire series on Industrial Light and Magic on Disney, which I highly recommend because it is a deep dive in what these people were doing, and it was all creative problem solving. It was,
Yeah.
guys that had done the singing raisins, for the California raisins,
Yeah.
and he was bringing them in because they were the only ones that knew how to do some of these things. And he's like, no, it's got to be better than that. It's got to look like
Yeah.
this. And we're creating a universe where you can't even think about these things. We're focused on character.
Yeah.
So, going back to the original idea of all these props, The lightsabers were made from flash handles on old cameras. The blasters, he's like, I don't want them to look like anything else. Well, they had a bunch of movie props from Nazi guns, and he's like, so they started riveting bits and pieces onto these things, and they would fold the stock, and that's what
Yes.
stormtroopers. And now you try to find that gun, the price of those antique guns has gone through the roof because there's Star Wars collectors out there that want to devour them and turn them into authentic prop replicas, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it was all creative problem solving. It was so
Yeah.
fascinating, and that's what, as a filmmaker, I'm like, well, how can we do that?
Yeah.
And we do have that blueprint. I've always wanted to. I haven't done it yet, but I've always wanted to go back and I want to create a shot of an X-wing flying over a green screen. There's a million YouTubes of guys doing it out there, but what a great experience to understand what true compositing is,
Yeah.
where you're doing the matte cutting and all that sort of thing. So,
And I
um,
love on the Death Star, the shot of that it is actually a video switcher, which is being that moved from up to down. It's a
that's
video
right.
switcher handle that's actually launching the Death Star, or the missile
Yeah.
attack. I think
And
it's
you see that
hilarious.
same thing come up in Rogue One, right? That's how they patch through to get the signal
Yes.
out. There's that stupid video switcher that's probably came out of somebody's studio that they replicated and put in there. And you see him in the Millennium Falcon. He's all these things that he's got to move and
Yeah.
twist and all that. So they're all just pieces of old battleships and whatever was
Yeah.
lying around Elstree Studios when they were out there.
Yeah. It's great. Um, what about, the kind of, I think when we go to the on-set challenges and behind the scenes stories, you know, uh, it's it's always fascinating things you read. Some things are rumors, some things but
Sure.
always fascinating things. What were some of the toughest production challenges that the team faced across the trilogy? I'm curious to what are some things that jump out at you?
I guess the droids were probably two of the biggest battles they were always fighting, especially in the first movie. Anthony Daniels was a fairly slender character, so they form fit that costume for him. Well, it's one thing to be in the studio on black polished floors, moving around and doing your thing, but to get out into the desert, he had no mobility. They would lay out
Right.
huge pieces of plywood for him to walk and then set camera up so that you couldn't see this plywood. And same with R2. They couldn't move. R2 was kind of a nightmare because that was RC technology that nobody was really doing. And then they also wanted to put an actor inside of it. So, some of the things that they had to really trial with was, how do we have caricature, right, from R2? Because if he just kind of moves in and beep boop bop, no, let's make his head move. Let's make this
Right.
little nodule, his little camera thing move. Let's do these sort of things. Let's put an actor in there so he can emote. And there are
Right.
times where you can see Kenny Baker in there kind of doing his thing, and my God, it works. And some of that's the credit to the editors of taking those caricatured movements and putting them in there. But those were huge problems for them. There's an entire segment to some of these documentaries where you see R2 falling off a platform. You see Anthony Daniels tipping over,
Man.
and Anthony Daniels' helmet was screwed
Yeah.
on.
Okay.
And they're out in the Tunisian desert, and it's either freezing cold or burning hot, and he's in a plastic suit, and he can't get that off. And
Yeah.
they could barely get a straw in there for him to drink water because there was a little, a piece of vellum or something over the mouthpiece.
Yeah.
So he would get stuck in that thing all the time, or he'd fall over and nobody would see him. So he's laying,
Wow.
face down in the sand. So those were constant issues. I think I've never really heard them complain about it, but the lightsabers were a bit of a nightmare. They were, these hilts were built out of, I told you, the camera flashes, but they had a little motor in them, and they would spin a graphite rod that was wrapped in a reflective material that they use on movie screens. And
Okay.
they pop up a big key light, and that would reflect back to camera.
Right.
If you watch the original trilogy, they really didn't color these things very well. And there's a very specific scene when Vader fights Kenobi, and they're clacking these really kind of lame props back and forth, and the light reflection dips out at one point. And I could never figure out in all the re-releases that Lucas never fixed that. Um,
Really.
but that was, to me, had to have been a nightmare to get there. And then you watch how they make the prequels, and they're just going at it and they're slapping these things. And so the fight scenes were much more fleshed out in the prequels than they were in the originals. And
Yes.
Lucas really did want that to be kind of a spectacle. Couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It had to
Yeah.
be movements and more facial and that sort of thing. But you've got this big cloggy guy that can't see out of a helmet or anything, and an elderly man. I shouldn't say elderly; he was my age
Yeah.
when he filmed it. But those were the sort of things that they were combating with. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and this carries through all three of the original movies, is in particular episode 4, the crew did not understand what the hell Lucas was doing.
Right.
You're talking about union guys that show up from 8 to 5. They get 2:15s and a half hour lunch, and that's contractual, right? So nobody understood what he was doing. His director of photography was kind of an old curmudgeon and just could not understand why Lucas was insisting on lighting being this way and that way. I don't know the details of what Lucas would fight for versus the DP, whose name is, and I should know it off the top of my head. Any other day, I'd be able to tell you. But they would kind of get into it a little bit because Lucas would come in and start lighting up sets, and he'd be like, "Stop! What are you doing? That's my job. That's what I
Right.
do. Is I light these things." But a lot of the crew could not understand why Lucas was, doing these takes over and over and over again. Lucas was not a great actor's director, so
Right.
he to his credit, went through some very arduous casting early on and then just kind of said, okay, you guys are moving through this hallway, look a little distressed.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, okay, and the crew, we want them lit from here to here. We want somebody to emerge out of the dark or, try to go in a trash compactor and try to make sense of that. They had no idea. Nobody had ever seen sci-fi done this way.
Right.
Most of them, sci-fi for a movie crew was, very gauche, mid-century modern design, lots of hard angles, and everything on Lucas sets was dirty or pristine, sterile, right? So your Empire
Right.
was very pristine, sterile. The rest of the
Yeah.
universe is a mess, and they
Right.
just could not wrap their heads around. They couldn't wrap their heads around the sand people and these banthas and trying to put an elephant in a suit. Why don't we just make it an elephant, and you
Right.
can put some paint on its snout or something like that. And he's like, no, this is the way it's going to work. So there was that trial, and that carried over to Empire with the crew. They had a little bit better idea, and of course now everybody wants to be on board, but they would still fairly combative. He had more money for world building. Fortunately, he had a really good visual direction team and art direction to subvert that. Irvine Kershner, the director of Empire, well, he's all about character, so he didn't care. He just wanted to get emotion.
Yeah.
Um, what's the third director's name? Gosh, I'm terrible today. Um, he didn't get
I
Star
don't.
Wars at
I
all.
don't know.
Yeah, he didn't get Star Wars at all, and so
Okay.
he kind of understood the technology. He directed some more action style films, so he was good with that. And Lucas, for some reason, didn't want to direct. Um, but what ends up happening is Lucas is directing all second unit stuff and getting these shots the way he wants to get them. So that was a trial for Lucas from the get go. And then forget about the executives, because till today they still don't really understand story. They just want to make something that people want to see.
Right.
And you brought up earlier that they went in. Alan Ladd went and pitched this movie to the board, and without those drawings, it would have never happened because they have to see what's going to be done.
Right.
And Lucas then finds himself, he's promised something pretty epic in drawings, and now you've got to somehow get that on camera.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
What a
it almost
challenge.
killed him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Amazing. Um, I was curious about some of the,
Marquand,
bloopers and
that's the
improv.
director's name. Marquand,
Ah,
I
very
think so.
good. I was curious some of the bloopers and improvisations we've heard about and read. I think the most famous one was, where Princess Leia says, "I love you," and uh, Han Solo says, "I know." That the story is that he ad libbed that line; it wasn't in the script. That's probably the most famous one. Any other ones that kind of jump out at you?
Um, that's certainly most iconic. And it's
Yes.
funny
What a great
because
line to add. I
Ford
mean, yeah,
totally King was
that's
like,
great.
he would never say I love you. He would never do
Yeah.
that. And so he dropped it on
Yeah.
him. And Kirshner and Lucas were like, dude, I don't know about that. We'll shoot it, but probably not going to
Yeah.
use that. That's not what I want. And of course that's what he says. Um,
Yes.
I think it's fairly interesting that in Empire, same movie, the I'm Your Father was was so well guarded. And Mark Hamill didn't
Yeah,
know till the
didn't they
day
write
of
it
shooting.
different ways?
You
They
bet.
had it be
Yeah,
different
yeah.
lines so that
Obi-Wan
no one
killed your
knew.
father was going to be what the crew was told, and that's what the actor David Prowse said in the cut. In the actual shot, that's what he says. Obi-Wan killed your father, and which is true. To one perspective, but Irvine Kershner walks up to Mark, and he's like, "I'm not getting the response from you that I need to get. I'm going to tell you something that I know, George knows, and now you know, and you cannot tell anybody." He says, "Darth Vader's your father, and he's going to tell you that while you're out there about to, decide whether you're going to join him or not." And Mark Hamill's like, "That changed everything for me." And
Right.
probably one of his better, specific performances was that gut wrenching understanding that this son of a bitch was your dad, and
Yeah.
you had basically come here to kill him, and he's your dad, and there's only one way out, and that's resignation, right? And
Yeah.
that sort of an emotional flop in a very well kept secret on set was capital.
And
They knew they
and
couldn't
in
tell
that,
Prowse because he would blow it. He would go leak it out and tell everybody. So they couldn't tell anybody these things.
yeah. And isn't it kind of interesting in that scene in Empire where he, screams out no, and then he kind of commits suicide. I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, how does he
Yes,
look down there and think anything good is going to come from him jumping down below? So his thought is like he just finds out that his father is this evil, ruler,
that's
and
right.
is kind of like, well, if I'm going to die, you know, do I think that it's interesting that they made that choice in that because there's no reason for him to know that he survives.
No, no. I
Yeah,
think you look down and there's an abyss. They show you
yeah,
his perspective. There's nothing there.
yeah,
His hand's down there somewhere. But he doesn't know. I mean, he has no idea. And so the idea, it's that man in the burning building is, if it's if he's jumping, the alternative must have been really bad. And
right.
and in Luke's mind, that's really something. And he's a wreck, right? He's got no hand. He's beat up. He's
Yep.
hanging on for dear life. He's probably out of juice at that point. And the option is go be that or take my chances.
And in
And
a kids movie,
I'm
right? I mean,
telling you,
people say, "Well, it's a kids movie." I was like, I don't know. I mean, it
I don't
has
know.
some very adult themes, and
I'm
that
telling you.
that you know,
And I think as kids we kind of struggled with that. I'm 7 or 8 at the time, and I'm definitely struggling with that. It's like, well, would it have been that bad? Maybe you could have fooled him or something, but um, there's there's a degree of integrity implied there.
yeah,
Luke's like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do
right,
that, and he proves out. And I think Jedi could have done a better job, to be critical.
yeah,
Could have done a better job of having Luke with a little more conflict. His conflict was in Jedi was, you know, do I take the dark side to save my friends, or do I suck it up? And then he gets it comes down and he can kill his father. That's the dark side, and he completely rejects that. And when you're 4 years older and you're witnessing this sort of thing and these choices, these are difficult things to wrap your head around. Kill that son of a bitch. He's the worst.
yeah,
And he just like, nope, I'm a Jedi like my father. I know he's still in there somewhere, which is really, really compelling and a little
yeah,
bit disturbing too. And that's not for kids. I, you know,
yeah.
I still
There,
get emotional when I see Jedi and Vader discovers that he has a sister and he says, sister, and Luke comes out and they play that music as well. I'm getting goosebumps right now.
yeah,
It is very compelling filmmaking, storytelling sort of a thing, and it's those little choices. And he
yeah,
kind of does give over. I felt like we could have had him a little more conflicted with that sort of thing.
yeah.
And
I think that there's a common journey of the relationship between father and son of your father when you're a child becomes your hero, and then as you become a teenager and you rebel they become a villain, and
right,
then you get older and they return to being a hero. because you
Yeah,
mature to that point. And I think that that's something that what I always loved about the choice of the end of Jedi was that redemption of father and son and that relationship going together, and that's a very adult theme,
it is, and
for
it's
a
under the
kids.
worst of terms too. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's terrifying,
yeah,
and there is a lot of self examination that as a film goer that you're hoping to see is that you learn something about yourself in that. And we can name off several films that I think most successful films, it's a reflection of what you've learned about yourself at the end of that story. Um, there's a lot of distractions in Star Wars that we can get wrapped up in, but really, this is Luke coming through and finishing strong. Um,
yeah,
and that honestly, that kind of plays against the the sequels, which came out later by J.J. Abrams and whatnot. Is that they didn't know how to deal with that. They didn't know how to reinvent that idea of reflect back to your audience decisions that they're making. But the trilogy nailed it.
yeah. Before I know we've chewed up a lot of time of your time, and I really
No,
appreciate
it's
it.
fine.
Before we wrap up, though, you brought up the sequels. I did want to ask your opinion on something. Mark Hamill, of course, was very vocal about his disagreement with the character choices they made for Luke
Yep.
with the sequels, because he just didn't feel like it was the same person, like it was a different character that would do that, that would
Yep.
abandon the Jedi ways, that would cut themselves off from the Force. That he just thought that Luke wouldn't do that.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
I'm conflicted at best. Ryan Johnson was the guy that. So J.J. Abrams writes The Force Awakens, and that was the perfect fan service film. It was really good, right?
Yeah,
It kind of put everything back together, and then at the end of it, you know, you see Luke for what 3 seconds or something like that,
yeah,
and I was good with all that. I think the
yes,
legend of
agreed.
him disappearing, we don't know quite why, was great. Ryan Johnson comes in and does something that, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, I appreciate. What I don't appreciate was that he kind of just took the whole Force Awakens script and threw it out and wrote his own story. Um, Again, I see the value in those, but changing Luke to that extent wasn't appropriate. And I think that um, I my understanding is Lucas would have treated that very differently. There's not a lot you can do about it once that damage is done. And it felt like Ryan Johnson wasn't being kept in check with the overall arc, or there was no overall arc discussed in this. They knew they were building 3 movies. Why
Yeah,
didn't they finish this out? I like the Ray character. I like the Poe character. I love
yep,
the Finn character, but he was
yep,
he's the most interesting character of all of it. He really is.
yeah,
Ray, we were
yeah,
seeing the hero's journey, but again,
right,
we didn't have a good perspective on that because we kind of lost the idea that you're supposed to be seeing this perspective from Stander by the droids,
right.
and they got distracted with that. But Finn is easily the most interesting character,
Yeah.
and they just kind of placate him for the next 2 movies. Whereas
Well,
he
yeah.
is
I
definitely
what
a
I
dark, hardened character.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I love what I loved about Force Awakens. One of the things that I loved was it answered a question for me about stormtroopers, because
Mm-hmm.
you kind of like, oh, they brainwash them and make them do these awful things. They
Right,
kidnap them and then they make them these kind of
they're conscripts, sure.
almost droids type of human, and sometimes they rebel. They something inside them makes them go, wait, I can't do this, even though I've been, and so I thought that was amazing. I agree they didn't explore that well enough with Finn. Um, and I agree too that the stuff that happened between I loved Ray. I thought she was perfect
Right.
for to be the new Luke Skywalker.
Yes.
But I think that, yeah, some of the choices about Luke and Kylo Ren and stuff I disagreed with, but I still enjoy watching them. It's like it's still a fun thing to watch. But
Sure. Oh,
but yeah, I would have.
there's some beautiful sequences in all of those,
Yeah,
and there's some really interesting character motivations. I love the petulance of Kylo Ren. I
yeah,
think that's super interesting. Um, Johnson eats that up a little bit, but then he just goes into a blind rage, and then it's a love story, and
yeah.
that's really what this is not about. And I
Right.
feel like some of those, Lucas always said you're rhyming, you're bringing up these same things and you're rhyming and repeating. We got some of that, but they didn't flesh a lot of that out appropriately, and it kills me because Lawrence Kasdan is this great writer, and they just kind of abandoned him, and then they go back on hands and knees with their hat in their hand and ask him to do the third one to try to pull him out of it. And what can you do about it? So yeah, there's some real beautiful stuff in that. All three of
Yeah.
those films.
Yeah.
There's some absolute failure, and
Yeah.
that's disappointing. I fantasize that maybe we'll just throw out the second two and let them pick up from Force Awakens. They'll
Yeah.
never do that.
Yeah. I don't
But
think they can do that.
Andor has kind of saved Star Wars for me in that sense.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
I
I
really
agree.
enjoyed. I don't know if you want to talk about really quickly the extended canon, but they've done some good stuff.
Yeah.
Um, Andor, obviously the best one.
Yeah.
They've also done some garbage
Yeah.
where they've lost
I
their
liked it.
way.
I liked it. I liked Andor, of course, is my favorite. But I enjoyed The Mandalorian.
Mhm.
I enjoyed the Kenobi one. I know some people didn't. I enjoyed it. Um, and I also enjoyed Ahsoka. It's fun.
Right,
A good series. Acolyte I didn't like.
right,
And there were some other things. I felt like it was like Brian Johnson was back with Acolyte because
right.
it felt like, okay, the Jedi's are the bad guys now. Like, let's just take
What
the
do we do?
entire universe that Star Wars is
Right.
and let's just throw that down the toilet. And oh,
Yep.
they were bad guys all along, kidnapping children, and it's like, uh,
Yeah.
I couldn't get with that.
I'm totally on board with that. Obi-Wan. My only problem with that is I felt like we left a little meat on the bone.
Uh,
And in particular the in humor is actually kind of important, even if
yeah,
it's subtle, and there was no humor to the Obi-Wan character. And in the prequels we got to see a little bit of lively idea and his own rebellious nature, but we
yeah.
didn't get to see a lot. He was just too sullen and sad, and that Leia
Oh, that's interesting.
character,
That's interesting.
the Leia character was a mess, and that kind of
Yeah,
messes with timelines and motivations and understanding of
yeah,
who's what. So I felt like they kind of blew it on that, but there was other really interesting stuff in there that
yeah.
the fake
I just
Jedi guy was
I
the
particularly
imposter.
love the face off between Anakin and Kenobi and
Great.
where Anakin says, you didn't kill me.
Right.
I killed yeah,
I'm not your
I killed
failure.
Anakin. You did,
That's right.
I loved that. For
I did
me, I
too.
was like, oh yes,
No, that
that
was
was
really
so
good
good.
squaring off.
Yes.
I would even go so far as to say there were Acolyte. Maybe it just shouldn't exist, but
Yeah.
it did have some
Yeah.
interesting ideas that I always wondered about. At the end, she lights up her saber and it turns red, and I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. We were always told
Yeah.
that they had to go get another crystal, that was a red crystal. That's what the Sith adored, but she just through her fury changes it red. And I thought, okay, that's pretty interesting. It's maybe not canonical, but what if that's how it really happens,
Right.
and that sort of thing. I think that's super interesting.
Yeah.
um I don't know if you saw the what was the not Wrecking Crew, what was the one with the little kids in it?
Oh, Skeleton Crew.
Skeleton Crew.
Yes, it was.
Not
That was a
bad.
great.
That was pretty
No, it was a
good.
great kid series. I mean, that was. I felt like almost. It was very. It's obviously for children, right? It's
Yeah,
safe for children and uplifting and funny,
yeah.
and I enjoyed it absolutely.
And they cast it well enough that these kids were believable, not too cardboard. um but it was Goonies meets ET meets Star Wars.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
it
like, well,
was.
that's where we all came in. You know,
Yeah.
I'm hoping the
Yeah.
kids that were our age, when they
Yeah.
see, maybe that's a good exposure, because there's the legendary, is he a Jedi or is he not? And
Right.
he's an ambiguous character. That was pretty good.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of applauded that. Like, okay, more of that. Keep it simple, stupid. You know, tell
Yeah.
this little story here, and let's play in Georgia's
Yeah.
sandbox, but let's not necessarily go that direction. Very interesting.
Right.
I thought that one was well done. So,
Yep.
you know, maybe
Absolutely.
there'll be some more thought process in this sort of a thing as they go forward.
Right. Absolutely. Well, let's to wrap up, anything, you wanted to comment on, or one story that maybe amazes you the most, or anything that kind of jumps out before we wrap the show.
Nothing amazes me anymore. And that might be what I finish this with is, the effects and the story of Star Wars. I'll just be an old man, say they don't make them like that anymore. And the sense of wonder on how they do it, which is what I love. I love to study and learn about how these guys overcame and did their creative problem solving, but a lot of that wonder is gone. So what I'm hoping to see is somebody to step into Georgia's sandbox and do something really original and unique. Ryan Johnson at one point had 3 new movies he was going to do in that sandbox. I think he probably would have had more success running his own trilogy as opposed to stepping in and teaming up with these other guys. But that's my hope, is that
Yeah.
doing the Andor series was a great pivot and a new perspective on a similar or the same story. I would like to see more of that, and it sounds like they're working in that direction. They're hiring some really good filmmakers,
Yeah.
people that I really admire, step in and do these new shows. So or movies. I'm looking forward to the new Mandalorian season or
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah.
I think that'll be super interesting. The one or the few bits I've seen of it look fantastic. So that's where my hope lies, is that they can let filmmakers go in and do what they do, and not really interfere. That's the spirit of Star Wars. That's, at least from the filmmaking side of things, that's what Lucas got to do.
Yeah.
To his own detriment and health, but you got to fight for those things, and you got to have executives who are like, that guy's got vision, let him go. So
Yeah, I've heard. Well said. Very well said. I'm encouraged by some of the decisions they've made. I think Dave Filoni has a good grasp of the Star Wars universe, and so
yep,
if he ends up being the new head honcho, that may be a good thing for everybody. But
totally
we'll
agree.
see.
I love that
Yeah.
guy. He's one of
Well,
us.
thanks for being on the show
Absolutely. Thanks
so
for having
much,
me.
Greg. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. And for those watching at home, make sure you subscribe to Uncle Nene's Nerdcast. And as always, please, for the love of God, stay nerdy.
That's it.